There is a Polish tradition at the Wigilia table, the Christmas Eve dinner that is the most sacred meal of the year in this country, of leaving one empty place setting. One empty chair, one unused plate, one unoccupied seat at the table. The tradition is old. It dates back centuries. It exists for the stranger who might arrive at your door on the holiest night of the year, hungry and cold, and it exists for the traveler far from home who cannot make it back in time. It exists as a gesture of openness, of welcome, of the fundamental human instinct to keep a place for someone who is missing. In December 1981, that empty chair meant something different. In thousands of Polish homes across thousands of Polish cities and villages, the empty chair at the Wigilia table was not for a stranger. It was for a husband, a father, a brother, a son. Someone who had been there at this table last year and was not there this year because 11 days before Christmas, soldiers had come to the door and taken him somewhere, and nobody would say where. This is the story of Christmas Eve under martial law. And if you think you understand what it means to spend Christmas with someone missing, stay with me, because what happened in Poland in December 1981 was something else entirely. On the night of December 12th, as Polish families were beginning the final preparations for Christmas, as women were planning their 12-dish Wigilia menus and children were hanging decorations on pine branches, something was moving through the country that those families could not yet see. General Wojciech Jaruzelski, who held simultaneously the positions of Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, and First Secretary of the Communist Party, had already signed the order. The military operation had been planned in secret for months. The posters announcing martial law had been printed in the Soviet Union and trucked into Poland under cover of darkness. Everything was in position, and just after midnight it began. By the time Polish families woke on the morning of December 13th to a Sunday bright with fresh snow on the rooftops, the country they had gone to sleep in no longer existed. Tanks stood at intersections in Warsaw, Krakow, Gdansk, Wrocław. Armored vehicles blocked the roads between cities. All telephone lines had been cut. The mail had been seized and subjected to censorship before it would be permitted to move again. The borders were sealed. Flights were grounded, except for Soviet aircraft. Radios and televisions, on the one channel that was still broadcasting, showed a single image. General Jaruzelski in military uniform, reading a prepared text that informed the Polish people that their country had been brought to the edge of an abyss and that the military was now in control. Within the first hours of that Sunday morning, more than 3,000 people had been arrested. By the end of the first week, that number had grown to 5,000. Solidarity leaders, dissidents and intellectuals were shipped to internment camps in locations that were not disclosed to their families. People who had attended a union meeting, people who had signed a petition, people who had spoken too openly at their workplace about conditions in the factory, people who had been pointed out by informants who may have had personal grievances entirely unrelated to politics. All of them taken, in many cases in the middle of the night, with no warrant presented, no charge explained, no destination provided. The families they left behind were placed in a particular kind of hell that has no good name in any language. It was not grief, because grief requires knowing. It was not fear, exactly, because fear at least contains information about what threatens you. It was a suspended state, a waiting with no object, a not knowing that had to be maintained through every waking hour and every sleepless night, without any indication of when or whether it would end. A wife with a young baby would ask at the police station where her husband had been taken. The officer behind the desk would look through her and say nothing. She would go home and listen to the radio, which told her that order was being restored and productivity was improving. She would look at the telephone, which was dead. She would try to write a letter, knowing it would be read and possibly never delivered. And then she would make dinner for herself and her child in an apartment that felt a different size than it had 11 days before. 11 days. That is how much time passed between the declaration of martial law and Christmas Eve. Not enough time for anything to be resolved. More than enough time for everything to feel permanent. The government, in a gesture that tells you everything you need to know about how it understood its own population, announced that the nighttime curfew would be lifted for Christmas Eve. Travel restrictions would also be eased for the holiday, allowing elderly people to visit their families. The ban on selling alcohol was temporarily suspended. These were the gifts the military government offered to a country it had just placed under armed occupation. You may visit your grandmother. You may buy vodka. You may sit at your Wigilia table without soldiers stopping you in the street on the way there. General Jaruzelski gave a Christmas address. He told the Polish people he could not wish them a merry or prosperous Christmas. He told them the holiday would be modest, but safe. Modest, but safe. The leader of a country that had just interned thousands of its own citizens in secret locations was explaining to the families of those citizens that their Christmas would be modest. The word choice was precise in a way that may not have been intentional, but was devastating regardless. Modest, as if the problem were the budget. As if what was missing from those tables were dishes, not people. What was actually missing from those tables was everything. The food shortages that had been grinding through the Polish economy for years had deepened sharply under martial law. The country was suffering a shortage of milk, medicine, soap, and fuel. Carp, the traditional centerpiece of the Wigilia feast, was available that year, to the government's apparent satisfaction, but its price had tripled since the previous year. One Warsaw woman, reported by the Associated Press, had traded her entire monthly meat ration for 2 fish. 2 fish, to put something at the center of the Christmas Eve table that her children could recognize as belonging to Christmas. She had made a calculation that most people, in most places, in most times, would never have to make, and she made it without hesitation, because that is what you do when you need the table to feel like a table and not like a monument to everything that has been taken from you. The churches were full. They were always full in communist Poland, because the church was the one institution the regime had failed to break, the one place in the country where the government's voice was not the only voice in the room. On Christmas Eve in 1981, the churches were fuller than usual. People came not only for the Mass, but for what the Mass represented in that specific moment, a space outside the state's control, a continuity that the tanks and the curfews and the arrested husbands had not managed to interrupt. The candles lit inside those churches on December 24, 1981, were not just religious symbols. They were a statement. We are still here. You have not finished us. The thing you cannot arrest is still burning. The Wigilia meal, when families sat down to it, was observed with the full weight of its ritual. The oplatek, the thin Christmas wafer, was broken and shared. Wishes were exchanged between every person at the table, eye contact held, each wish spoken and received with the deliberateness that the tradition requires. 12 dishes, or as many of the 12 as could be assembled from what was available. The mushroom soup. The carp if there was carp. The pierogi stuffed with cabbage and wild mushrooms. The kusha, the sweet grain pudding that families from certain regions insisted on regardless of circumstance, that grandmothers made in 1939 and in 1944 and in 1956, and were making again now. And the empty chair, in homes where a father or husband or brother had been interned and his location was unknown, the family set his place at the table anyway. His plate, his glass, his utensils arranged as if he might arrive before the meal was over. This was not denial. These were not families refusing to acknowledge what had happened. This was something more deliberate and more defiant than that. It was a declaration that his place at this table existed whether the government acknowledged it or not, that the family's definition of itself did not require the government's permission to remain intact, that whatever had been taken could not include this, could not include the place that was his at this table, in this family, on this night. Some of those men came home in weeks, some came home in months, some spent years in internment. A small number never came home at all. Over the full period of martial law, more than 90 people were killed. The families who set those empty places on Christmas Eve 1981 did not know yet which category they were in. They would not know for a long time. They set the place and waited and observed the ritual and broke the wafer and exchanged the wishes and ate what they had and sat in their coats because the heating had been reduced and the apartments were cold. Outside, the streets were patrolled. The soldiers were young, many of them barely older than the children sitting at those Wigilia tables, conscripts who had been handed a rifle and told this was necessary for the stability of the nation. Some of them, it was said, had refused their orders when those orders involved arresting workers they recognized as neighbors, as fathers of children their own children knew. Most did not refuse. The system does not function if most people refuse. By mid-January, letters began arriving at some of the internment camps, smuggled in or eventually permitted, carrying the news from home that the interned men had been without since their arrest. Wives wrote about the children. They wrote about the neighbors who had brought food. They wrote about Christmas, describing the dinner, the candles, the church, the empty chair, the wishes that had been made in his name at the table where his place had been set and kept for him. The men who received those letters said later that reading them was the hardest thing about those months. Not the cold of the camp, not the uncertainty, not the daily indignities that captivity inflicts. The letters. The evidence that the family had gathered at the table without him and had kept his place and had made wishes on his behalf into the candlelight. The evidence that the table had been set for 12 dishes and one empty chair, and that the empty chair had been the most important thing at it.